Pam Bondi was an icon in the legal world. Known for her sharp intellect, uncompromising sense of justice, and ironclad discipline, she was not just a lawyer when she stepped into the courtroom. She was a warrior. To her, justice wasn't just a set of written rules. It was a principle that had to be defended at all costs. But today, as she walked through the cold, high-ceilinged corridors of the courthouse, an unshakable unease settled within her. The weight pressing down on her chest wasn't just from the difficulty of the case ahead. As someone who had dedicated her life to the rule of law, she knew all too well what was possible inside a courtroom. Sometimes, facts were distorted, evidence was ignored, and the voice of the powerful drowned out the truth. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just facing a defendant, she was facing a figure who posed a threat to the justice system itself. Judge Daniel Mercer. His name was whispered behind closed doors. A man who was supposed to be the guardian of justice was, in reality, the backbone of a corrupt system. Allegations of bribery, questionable rulings, illicit connections, yet none had ever been proven. Every case brought against him had mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses had fallen silent one by one, and evidence had vanished without a trace. Mercer was a disease embedded deep within the legal system, and now Pam was preparing to confront it head-on. As she stepped through the courthouse's heavy wooden doors, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Journalists, attorneys, and curious onlookers lifted their heads. Everyone knew this wasn't just another trial. This wasn't just about determining the guilt of one man. It was a test to see if anyone was truly above the law. Her eyes locked onto Mercer, seated at the bench. As always, he exuded confidence. He adjusted his tie, leaned back slightly in his chair, and watched her enter with an air of indifference. But Pam was experienced enough to notice the subtle tension in his expression. Mercer was uneasy, because this time, he was facing someone who wouldn't back down. Pam set her bag on the table and took a deep breath. Today, this wasn't just a trial, it was the moment that would shape the future of the system. And no matter the cost, she was determined to uncover the truth. The trial wasn't just about the misuse of public funds. It was a battle to expose those who had remained untouchable for years, to uncover the hidden truths lurking behind the scenes, and to challenge a deeply corrupt system. The defendant was a powerful businessman who had forged close ties with the highest levels of government, brokered massive deals in the shadows, and evaded the sword of justice through political influence. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't just his connections, it was his audacity. He would go to any lengths to clear his name, even if it meant manipulating the very foundations of the law itself. And now, Judge Mercer, of the most critical figures in this web of corruption, had taken his seat on the bench. Pam knew this wasn't just another trial. This was a high-stakes chess match where the most powerful players were making their moves, a display of dominance. Who would be protected, and who would be sacrificed? Who would shield themselves behind the facade of justice, and who would be cast as the scapegoat? The gears of corruption kept turning, but this time, Pam was certain she would be the one to decide who got crushed beneath them. As the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, the stale air that filled the room only heightened the tension. Lawyers, journalists, and observers had gathered, believing they were about to witness an ordinary hearing. But Pam knew better. This trial would be anything but ordinary. As she walked toward the center of the room, hushed whispers spread around her. Everyone understood what was at stake. Either the last remnants of justice would be extinguished, or one of the most powerful figures in a broken system would finally be held accountable. Pam locked eyes with Mercer on the bench. As always, he exuded confidence, too much confidence. He was too indifferent, too self-assured for a judge in a case like this. He wasn't taking this trial seriously. Maybe he didn't have to. After all, every accusation against him had conveniently disappeared into the void. The invisible hands protecting him had always intervened, making every charge vanish without a trace. But this time, things were different. As she entered, Mercer's lips curled into a smug smirk. His eyes carried an unmistakable message. You're wasting your time. To him, this trial was nothing more than a formality, a ceremonial performance, a procedural exercise. And in the end, just like always, he expected to walk away unscathed. Pam hesitated for a brief moment. What made Mercer so confident? Was it the power he wielded or the unseen hands shielding him from the consequences? But no matter the answer, one thing was certain. Everything had to change in this courtroom. The game had begun, and she had no intention of being just another pawn. Mercer sat on the bench with his usual air of arrogance. The heavy silence that filled the courtroom was like the tense stillness before a storm. He locked eyes with Pam Bondi, the corners of his lips curling into a smug smirk. Then he took a deep breath and let his voice ring through the room. "Ms. Bondi, we've heard you have high expectations for today's proceedings. I hope they turn out the way you imagined." He watched as his words settled over the courtroom. The defense attorneys exchanged faint smiles. A few individuals lowered their heads, stealing condescending glances at Pam. It was as if her mere presence here was a challenge to Mercer's authority. Pam Bondi, however, didn't flinch. She had caught the dismissiveness in the judge's tone, but it didn't shake her. Slowly, she opened her file, letting her fingers glide over the pages. These weren't just sheets of paper each. One was a piece of evidence exposing the inner workings of a corrupt machine. She lifted her gaze to Mercer. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I am here to present substantial evidence of the misuse of public funds. This is a matter of justice, and I have come in pursuit of it." For a moment, silence gripped the room. The smirks on the defense's side faded slightly. There was something about Pam's confidence, about the certainty in her voice, that made them realize this hearing might not go as they had expected. Finally, Mercer's smirk faltered, just a little. He could see that Pam wasn't here to play games. Straightening slightly in his seat, he set his pen down on the desk in front of him. "Very well," he said, his tone carrying a hint more seriousness now. "Let's see what you've got." Pam leaned over her desk, carefully selecting the first document. The weight in the room was almost tangible. She was ready to make her first move. This wasn't just a trial. This was the beginning of a system's downfall. Sinister smirks spread across the defense team's faces. The attorneys tilted their heads slightly, whispering among themselves as if a high-stakes game had just begun. Some exchanged mocking glances, while others tapped their pens impatiently against the table. The moment the judge's deep voice echoed through the courtroom, silence fell. Pam locked eyes with Mercer, unblinking. His arrogance, his false sense of control gave her more of an advantage than he realized. She took a deep breath, her steady hands opening the file in front of her. Feeling the weight of the moment, she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing through the room with perfect clarity and conviction. "I am here today not just for a trial, but to ensure the justice the people deserve. I trust you will agree that the evidence I present will reveal not only the misuse of public funds, but also the dark alliances behind it." A faint murmur spread through the courtroom. Some of the defense attorneys leaned toward one another, eyeing Pam with thinly veiled amusement. To them, this trial was merely a stage for their client's power to be reaffirmed. Mercer remained silent for a moment, his brown eyes bore into Pam as he slowly straightened in his seat. Then, as if her words had merely entertained him, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. A few others in the courtroom followed suit, chuckling under their breath. In the back row, a man leaned over to whisper something to the person beside him, making sure Pam saw it. She tilted her head slightly, but never looked away from the judge. This was her stage now. The game had begun, and this time, she would be the one holding the reins. Mercer shook his head again, his smirk deepening. He knew exactly what her accusations implied, and he seemed to find the whole thing amusing. "Justice, huh?" he scoffed. "How dramatic, Ms. Bondi. Most people wouldn't be able to deliver such an impressive opening statement." His voice dripped with condescension. A few observers chuckled softly, while others merely shrugged, as if this were nothing more than a spectacle, and Pam was taking it all too seriously. But she wouldn't let it shake her. "Yes, dramatic," she said, leaning forward slightly. "But the real tragedy here isn't my tonights how lightly justice is being taken. Is this courtroom a place where a defendant is allowed to treat public funds like their personal fortune?" For a moment, the room turned ice cold. Mercer's smirk faltered ever so slightly. His eyes stayed locked on hers as she continued. "If these allegations were baseless, I wouldn't waste the court's time. But I have in my hands clear evidence of how state funds were illegally redirected. The public is watching, Your Honor, and they are waiting for answers." Murmurs broke out from the defense side. One attorney shifted uncomfortably before abruptly raising his voice. "These are nothing but unfounded accusations," he barked. Pam didn't even glance his way. She placed her hand firmly on the table, exhaling slowly. "We have sworn witnesses," she said with unwavering certainty. "We have banking records, unauthorized payments, and deceptional, meticulously documented. Evidence collected legally, leaving no room for doubt." Mercer suddenly coughed, the lines on his forehead deepening. His gaze drifted for a fraction of a second before his brows furrowed. His voice, harsher this time, rang through the tense room. "You'd better be careful with every claim you make, Miss Bondi." Pam arched a brow, tilting her head ever so slightly. "That's exactly my point, Your Honor," she said coolly. "We must be careful. Every detail, every document, every transaction. We have it all." The courtroom was so silent that even the rustling of a single sheet of paper echoed. Pam lifted the document in her hand and turned toward the jury. These records prove not only that the defendant misused public funds, but also who conspired with him to cover it up. The defense attorneys shifted in their seats, their confidence cracking. Mercer pressed his hands firmly against the desk, his expression tightening. He started. But this time, his voice lacked its usual strength. Pam could smell victory in the air. The tides were turning, and Mercer knew it just as well as she did. "Your Honor," Pam said, her voice unwavering, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A12. These documents provide clear evidence that public funds were unlawfully transferred into private accounts. And interestingly enough, one of those accounts is linked to a foundation associated with you." For a moment, the courtroom was swallowed by absolute silence. Mercer's self-assured smirk remained, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. The defense team exchanged glances, while the journalists in the room hurriedly scribbled down notes. Pam placed the documents on the table, carefully flipping through the pages until she reached the most damning section. "As you can see here," she continued, "large sums of money withdrawn from public funds were first dispersed into multiple accounts before being funneled into various foundations. And one of those foundations is directly connected to a charity bearing your name, Your Honor. Are you suggesting this is just a coincidence?" Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting from the documents in Pam's hands to the faces around the courtroom, as if trying to reassert control. "These are merely speculative allegations, Miss Bondi. In this court, only concrete evidence holds weight, not assumptions." Pam allowed herself a small smile. She had been expecting that response. Reaching into the inner pocket of her jacket, she pulled out a small USB drive and held it up. "Then perhaps these records will be concrete enough for you, Your Honor." The lead defense attorney immediately shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we need to question the manner in which this evidence was obtained. Our client's privacy rights may have been violated." Pam turned to face him, her expression calm yet razor-sharp. "I can assure you that I followed all legal procedures before bringing this to court. These documents and recordings were obtained lawfully. And might I remind you that your client, Judge Mercer, isn't the defendant in this case. However, it seems you've considered that possibility before I even mentioned it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The journalists tightened their grips on their notepads and cameras. Mercer rolled his eyes, attempting to mask the subtle discomfort creeping onto his face. He banged his gavel against the bench. "I will have order in my courtroom. Miss Bondi, proceed." Pam was ready to play her strongest hand. This trial wasn't just about corruption, it was about exposing the darkest corners of the justice system itself. The air in the courtroom grew heavy. A tense silence settled over the room, as if everyone was asking the same question. What happens now? Judge Mercer leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked onto Pam. His pupils seemed to shrink into the slits of his narrowed eyes. A faint, unreadable smirk formed at the corner of his lips. Was it doubt? Arrogance? It was nearly impossible to tell. "Your allegations are getting more dramatic by the minute, Miss Bondi," he said with a mocking tone. "But let me remind you, allegations hold little value in this courtroom. Only facts and evidence matter." A murmur rippled through one corner of the room. Mercer's unwavering confidence sent an uneasy wave through those in attendance. He'd been rooted in the system for years, writing his own rules in the shadows of justice. In his world, the words of the powerful were law, and justice was merely a word. But Pam Bondi was here to shatter that very system. Pam opened her briefcase. With deliberate slowness, she pulled out a small black USB drive, making sure everyone could see. Then she met Mercer's gaze. "Is that so?" she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Then maybe these recordings will mean something." For a brief moment, silence reigned. Every eye in the room turned to her. Lawyers, jurors, journalists, 7 the security officers standing quietly at the back all unknowingly held their breath. Pam handed the USB drive to the court clerk. "Play it." The clerk hesitated, glancing at Mercer, silently waiting for his approval. But before the judge could utter a word, Pam spoke again. "I think it's time we see where justice truly stands," she said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. After a brief pause, the clerk inserted the USB into the computer. Within seconds, a muffled voice crackled through the speakers. The voice didn't belong to the defendant. It wasn't a witness. Everyone froze. Pam's eyes remained fixed on Mercer. The moment played out like a scene from a movie. No one could look away from the speakers. The voice on the recording was low, clipped, but unmistakably clear. "The money trail can't be traced. Move the funds, erase the records, and shut it down." That voice, it was Judge Mercer. A wave of shock rippled across the courtroom. Unspoken words filled the air, reflected in widened eyes and tightened jaws. The once untouchable Judge Mercer, the man hailed as the embodiment of justice, was caught on tape. And it was enough to shake the very foundation of the courtroom. Mercer's smirk vanished. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers curling over the armrest. He was muttering something under his breath, but his words hung in the air, incomplete, uncertain. Gasps and whispers spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every second of the moment that could change everything. Time itself seemed to pause, suspended by the weight of undeniable truth. Pam leaned in slightly, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Your Honor, are you claiming this recording is fake?" Mercer wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and shot her a glare. This evidence was obtained illegally. It holds no validity in court." Pam tilted her head, offering a knowing smile. "That's for the court to decide, Your Honor. But the recording contains your voice. Can you deny that?" Mercer's fingers clenched the edge of the bench. The air in the courtroom felt colder, heavier. No one moved. The truth had settled like gravity itself, pressing down on him. Pam continued, "This recording is only the beginning. We have more evidence. And believe me, Your Honor, it will mean much more to you." Mercer's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I have the right to question where this recording came from, Miss Bondi." Pam placed her hands firmly on the table, locking eyes with him. "I think," she said, "we should be discussing the authenticity of the recording, shouldn't we? Because if this is real, then you are just as guilty as the defendant, Your Honor." The entire room held its breath. For the first time, something flickered in Mercer's gaze. Fear. A realization. He was calculating. Should he run? End the trial on a technicality? Continue denying? But none of that mattered anymore. The clock was ticking, and justice was finally speaking. One of the defense attorneys shot to his feet. This recording. Where did it come from? Your Honor, we need to discuss the legality of this evidence. It has no place in this courtroom. Pam leaned forward, planting her hands firmly on the table. There wasn't even a trace of hesitation in her voice. "Your Honor," she said, slowly gathering her files. "Instead of debating whether this recording is admissible, perhaps we should discuss why its contents make you so uncomfortable. The evidence presented to this court clearly shows the misappropriation of public funds. And, more interestingly," she paused for a brief moment, locking eyes with Mercer. "One of those transactions was deposited directly into an account linked to your foundation." The courtroom turned ice cold. Mercer's expression tensed. His eyes flickered for just a second before he quickly regained his composure. Lifting his eyebrows, he responded with a cold smirk. "Don't waste our time with this nonsense, Miss Bondi." Pam twirled a small USB drive between her fingers. "Are you absolutely sure we can't trace the stolen funds, Your Honor?" she asked. Then, with a single press of a button, the next recording played. This time, the voice rang out, crystal clear. "No one will find out. Alter the records. Add false entries. Funnel the money into the foundation. We'll take care of the rest." The same voice. The same inflections. The same arrogance. There was no doubt. It was Judge Mercer. The courtroom was frozen in place. A few lawyers shifted uncomfortably. A journalist's pen slipped from their fingers, clattering against the desk, breaking the unbearable silence. Mercer's eyebrows drew together, his lips pressing into a thin line. A low murmur spread through the gallery. A juror shifted in his seat. Another clasped his hands tightly. The defense team whispered among themselves in a frantic panic. Pam didn't take her eyes off Mercer. "This is just the beginning," she continued. "Would you like me to present the rest of the evidence, Your Honor? Or do you have a statement that might change the course of this trial?" Mercer's face had lost its color. The confidence he had worn so effortlessly moments ago had vanished. He leaned back in his chair, lips pressed tightly together, before letting out a short, hollow laugh. Shaking his head with forced amusement, he spoke again. "And what's the source of this evidence, Ms. Bondi?" His voice was laced with desperation. "We don't even know where it came from. Couldn't it be fabricated?" Pam calmly lifted another stack of documents and held them up for the courtroom to see. "We have proof that this recording was obtained legally, Your Honor. And more importantly, we have financial records that match the transactions in the recordings. The accounts are real. The money trail is undeniable." As the defense team angrily rose to protest, Mercer took a deep breath. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked from the room. His eyes held the look of a man losing control. He clenched his jaw, spitting his words through gritted teeth. "Ms. Bondi, you know damn well this evidence has no standing in court. We don't even know where it came from." Pam tilted her head slightly, a knowing smile on her lips. "Perhaps, Your Honor," she said, "you're no longer the one in control of this courtroom." A wave of hushed whispers swept across the room. Mercer's face flushed red, his fury unmistakable. He tried to compose himself, but Pam could see at the fear he was trying so hard to mask. That day, it wasn't just a businessman on trial. The judge sitting on the bench was about to be judged too, and Pam was ready to deliver the final blow that would bring it all crashing down. A spark ignited in the courtroom. In the silence, a low murmur began to rise, eerie and charged like the wind before a storm. Whispers. Uneasy glances. Everyone was still reeling from the impact of the recording. A shockwave rippled through the room, sweeping over each person in turn. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Pam noticed Mercer's trembling hand. A judge's anger was supposed to stem from authority, from control. But Mercer's rage was nothing more than a desperate attempt to mask his panic. Judges were meant to be impartial, composed, unshakable. And yet, here he was, veins bulging, face ashen. Then, suddenly, he shot up from his chair. His hand slammed against the bench. "Miss Bondi," he thundered. This so-called evidence was clearly obtained through illegal means. A prosecutor of your experience presenting unlawfully acquired recordings as evidence, it's an insult to the justice system. But his voice was strained so tight, so brittle, that it was impossible to miss how his famed confidence had completely unraveled. He was rattled. Pam didn't flinch. She held his gaze, then took a step forward. She could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath. "Your Honor," she said, her voice as unyielding as stone. "If this recording is fake, then why are you so nervous?" The room went still. Then, the murmurs returned. Confusion, frenzied whispers. The journalists scrambled to take note. Attorneys whispered hurriedly among themselves. Jurors shifted in their seats. Everyone turned to one another, trying to process the weight of the moment. Mercer's face was rigid, his fists clenched, his teeth ground together. "Nonsense," he spat. This is a conspiracy, a smear campaign that has been going on for years. No one has fought harder for justice than I have in 01. Pam leaned against the table, her gaze locked onto his. "Then shall we continue listening to the recordings?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or, Your Honor, do you have another explanation?" The courtroom turned to ice. Mercer took a deep breath, but instead of steadying him, it only made the tension in his body more obvious. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple, highlighting the cracks in his hardened exterior. He had never imagined that this recording would find its way into the light. The power he had spent years amassing it was slipping through his fingers. Pam casually lifted the document in her hand, letting it sway slightly, almost like a ticking clock. Mercer looked like a prisoner, awaiting his final verdict. He struggled for words, but they caught in his throat. Somewhere in the crowd, a spectator murmured, "Is that really his voice?" Another whispered, "If this is true, how has he fooled everyone for so long?" The defense attorneys exchanged frantic glances. Some turned to Mercer, others bowed their heads, at a complete loss for what to do next. At that moment, it wasn't just the defendant under scrutiny. It was the man sitting in the highest seat of the courtroom. Mercer, unwilling to let his authority be questioned, slammed his hand against the table once more. "This ends now," he barked. "The document and recordings presented as evidence were obtained unlawfully. I will not allow them to be used in this court." But this time, no one flinched. No one looked away. The jurors, the courtroom spectators, the members of the press, they sat in silence, exchanging glances. There was a commotion, hushed whispers filling the air, but Mercer's outburst had lost its grip on them. Pam, standing tall and unshaken, tilted her head slightly and held up the USB drive. A knowing smile played on her lips. "If the recording is fake, Your Honor," she asked coolly, "then why are you so afraid?" Mercer glared at her, his jaw clenched. For the briefest moment, panic flickered in his eyes, but then, just as quickly, he buried it. The entire room was silent, waiting. He was a master at navigating tense moments, but this time, something was different. This time, even he knew. The whispers grew louder. Would Judge Mercer back down? Or would he finally be forced to face his own darkness? This time, it wasn't the court that would decide which voice would be heard. The evidence would.